how does financial therapy work?
I think the reality is that it works like how therapy for most other issues works. I think about the experience of individuals who grew up without a lot of money and then in adult life maybe have been more financially stable or been financially sort of very successful and are navigating an experience of, in early formative years, living with scarcity. Of course, that then gets bound up in all kinds of morality and shaming and guilt, those things in ways that we're not always so consciously aware of become a part of us and we carry them with us. And often people think, oh, well, money was a big issue in my house, so I'm just going to make sure that I'm really successful so that I don't have that problem. And that can be great and certainly works for some people. But even when we solve a kind of material problem, often the emotionality sort of follows us and sometimes not so consciously impacts how we operate as adults.
Hey everyone, it's Jean Chatzky. Thank you so much for joining me today on Her Money at the start of the new year, a fresh calendar page. That also means it's a really good time to think about making some changes in our lives if we need them. And by the way, who doesn't? I gotta say, according to some recent data, some of us really are in need of a change. A study by Wells Fargo showed that when it comes to our finances, 42% of Americans say they're not able to live within their means, and another quarter say they're in poor financial shape, which to me says maybe 2025 is the year that we get serious about building some financial stability, financial resilience, a healthier relationship with money overall. But here's the thing. Sometimes money is not just math. Often, money is not just math. There are typically, I think, some undiscovered, sometimes hidden reasons why many of us would rather not look at the statements that reflect our holiday spending, why we loan money to friends when we really can't afford to do that, why we don't save more, why we don't invest at all. There are so many things that we do or don't do that leave us feeling stressed out about our finances. And it's really only once we dig in and start to understand the psychological and emotional reasons behind why we do what we do that we can start to change our behavior in a way that actually sticks. We have seen this over and over again in our Finance Fix course. One of the things that we do in that course is take a dive into your money story. We unpack your money history, which is basically the way you were raised. It's not necessarily what you were taught, but really what you absorbed in your home of origin. And once you understand that those elements still have a hold on you, no matter how old you are, then you can start to change course and finally start using your money as the tool it is to support the life you want. But it all starts with trying to establish a healthy relationship with your money. Matt Lundquist is a Columbia University trained psychotherapist. He is the founder of Tribeca Therapy in New York City, and he says that money is one of the biggest issues for his clients in his practice. He is with us today to dig into our money issues, your money issues, and walk us through the steps that we can take to try to make this the year that we really improve our relationships with money once and for all. Matt, welcome.
So nice to be here, Jean. Thanks for having me. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. I'm curious how you became sort of the go-to psychotherapist for money issues. You've really developed an expertise and a reputation in this area.
Sure. Well, thank you. That's very flattering. I think New York City is a big place. I think there's probably lots of folks who do this work, but I think it has emerged. We often say as therapists, our specialization, sometimes we pick them and sometimes they pick us. And one of the things I found early in my career was that money was something that people, as you certainly know, often really don't like to talk about. It's sort of up there with sex and death and some of these other kind of taboo subjects that people really avoid even in therapy. But one of the questions we grapple with as therapists is it my maybe reluctance to go there as a therapist because of perhaps my own insecurities, my own kind of uncomfortable feelings about this, or is it in fact the client or the patient's reluctance? And I think feeling a sense of obligation to make sure that I'm not the one kind of setting a limit on that. And so I did a lot of my own work around looking at money and my historical and emotional relationship with money. You mentioned in your opening, money has a history, and often how money existed in our families and how we grew up has a big impact on how we do money as adults, as do lots of other things, kind of societal and emotional issues. And discovered along the way that there really weren't a lot of therapists talking about this who had kind of done the work to build their fluency with this. And also discovered that I was kind of good with money. And so certainly what people don't come to me with is financial planning and financial advice. The experts who do that are fantastic at what they do. But where folks come to me to talk about money is when they have some sense of what the right thing to do is or how to find the right counsel, but they've recognized that there's something in the way for them that isn't sort of fixed by knowing more, by just simply having good counsel, that there's something stuck in them.
I can relate to so much of what you just said. I think my career found me. I didn't necessarily find it. And I think it found me because in my 20s, my financial life was a bit of a mess. I wasn't dealing with it. I was avoiding. And it was only once I started reporting on personal finance and these really smart people told me what I should do that I couldn't avoid doing the right thing anymore. And when it comes to knowing the right things to do, like with diet and exercise, I mean, we know if we eat better and move a little more, we're going to be in better shape. And we know if we spend a little less and try to save a little more, we're going to be in better financial shape. But many of us can't get ourselves to just do those things. When clients come to you in your practice, I mean, what do you think, what are the factors that are driving this disconnect between doing the right thing and not being able to?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think just to really join in what you're saying, I think great financial advisors like physicians and dietitians and nutritionists are amazing. And I think often knowing more is very helpful. But there is, of course, that moment where you recognize, I know exactly what I need to be eating. I know exactly how I need to be kind of managing my financial life, but I keep kind of month to month not doing that. I think that it's obviously so different for different people. And I think ultimately in therapy, we really have the luxury of kind of really diving into an individual person's particular experience and particular history. But I think what I've come to recognize in terms of some common themes are that people are tending to relate to this as just a matter of willpower. And so another month goes by, obviously another year goes by, there's the reckoning of filing taxes and kind of the different ways that we tend to reconcile at the end of an old year, beginning of a new year. And often what people will say is, oh, I know what I need to do. I just need to work harder. I just need to be more disciplined. And they do things like create a budget or use like a budgeting app. And again, those can be great tools, but I think over and over again, what people often fall into is, I just need to try harder. I just need to try harder. And if that works, that's great. But I'm assuming if that's worked for them, that probably they're not in my office, because what's suggesting is that there's something more complicated going on there that I think we need to be curious about.
What are those complicating factors typically? And how does financial therapy work? How do you get to them?
Yeah. I think the reality is that it works like how therapy for most other issues works, which is I think we have to do some exploring to understand what else is what we call bound up in an individual's relationship with money. Money can be symbolic. I think about the experience of individuals who grew up without a lot of money and then in adult life maybe have been more financially stable or been financially sort of very successful and are navigating an experience of in early formative years living with scarcity or seeing the model in a parent, or parents have to by necessity navigate scarcity. There's ways, of course, that then gets bound up in all kinds of morality and shaming and guilt, wanting a particular present perhaps that other kids at school have when the funds simply aren't available to do that, and feeling a sense either because parents are shaming, or parents aren't shaming, but there's a kind of self-shaming that comes around that, and the sort of complicated feelings that come with the vulnerability of wanting and being disappointed, the experience of hunger, perhaps sometimes literal hunger or metaphorical hunger, and then disentangling that later on. But there's lots of things. Patients talk to me about experience of divorce and the ways that money is so often both as a very real thing and also symbolically parents fighting with one another around that, or even without divorce, parents blaming, shaming, fighting about that, a parent losing a job, the experience of perhaps downward mobility, the experience of having a certain level of stability and then losing it. And there's ways that those things that in ways that we're not always so consciously aware of become a part of us, and we carry them with us. And often people think, oh, so, well, money was a big issue in my house, so I'm just going to make sure that I'm really successful so that I don't have that problem. And that can be great and certainly works for some people. But even when we solve a kind of material problem, often the emotionality of a different moment early on sort of follows us, and sometimes not so consciously, not so awaredly impacts how we operate as adults.
So I want to get truly tactical with this. I know that my listeners appreciate it, but the first thing I wonder before we dig into overcoming some money problems and getting started with that is, are there things that we can do in advance to prevent these problems from arising? Is there anything we can do, I would say in our 20s and 30s, but no matter what age we are, to get in front of this?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that most of the time, obviously people's individual experience varies, and I think this varies across class and income level and kind of all of those kinds of things. But I think for most people, their 20s are a time where perhaps they're earning less money, but hopefully also have less financial obligation. And of course, that's certainly different in different people's situations. But I think that if there's an opportunity earlier on in adulthood to, while the one's financial situation is relatively simpler, work on establishing some goals and habits and norms that will then persist when things get more complicated. And so as one has maybe the opportunity to have access to more funds and the great opportunity that comes with that, there's also more possibility of getting into trouble. I think when you're simply paying rent, that is a serious obligation and a grown-up obligation that comes with complications, but perhaps is a different kind of financial obligation than the expenses that come with having children, with being partnered, with having a mortgage, with having kind of more sophisticated and complicated financial life. And so looking at that as a period of time to build good habits while things are hopefully a little bit simpler, I think is one big one. Noting how much money you have, really being self-conscious about your relationship with debt, using a budget if that's a tool that's necessary, building kind of month-to-month accountability, facing difficult issues rather than burying them and hiding from them, which is, I think, a common experience of folks earlier on in adulthood.
I think facing rather than hiding is a big one, but sometimes it's hard to recognize when you're just income strapped or when you actually have an unhealthy relationship with money. What are the signs?
Yeah, I think some of the signs are pretty obvious, but I think in some ways that's implicit in your question, which is, I think these are the kinds of experiences that people bring to me in therapy where they say, in retrospect, it should have been obvious at the time. Here were the following signs, but I wasn't just seeing them. So, I'll tell you what some of those things are that we're seeing, but I also think there's a kind of a problem of perception, which is that money is a place where we can tend to have a lot of denial. But those signs are, listen, I think having a sense of finding oneself regularly when you get a credit card statement or of having an experience of saying, that's so strange. I feel like I should have more money than I have. That's a very common one. Looking at a credit card bill and saying, whoa, I had no idea I spent that much money. I think when we notice that there are areas where our idea of what's happening based on our own sort of self-tracking isn't aligned when actual concrete data shows up in the form of, a credit card statement or hitting an overdraft, needing to kind of log in and check a balance and noticing that it's lower. And I think sometimes I invite people to think about let the concrete markers aren't always going to tell you the full story, but let them at least invite scrutiny. Let them invite you to slow down and say, I need to take a closer look at this. And then think about what that process is where you're going to look at that, even if it's scary. Invite a friend to kind of look through that with you. Go through your credit card statement with a partner and do the exercise of making that rhetorical question of like, where'd all my money go, into a real question, and really, but use those markers, use those reminders in the form of kind of bumping up against reality to prompt you to do some looking.
I know that the numbers, and from doing this work for years, are really scary for a lot of people. But what we find, and when we take people through our Finance Fix classes, which is watching where your money's going essentially, and then making some tweaks, it's freeing. Actually, you think it's going to be really scary, but once you discover what you're able to control and where you're able to make some changes, it's not nearly as scary as you thought, and you can take a lot of that power back.
Yeah. So many times people talk to me about, I haven't looked at my credit card statement in months. I've stopped opening it, or, oh gosh, I haven't talked to my wife about the checking account, and I don't even know what all we're behind on. I had my own experience when I finished grad school. I had a ton of student loans, and the way it worked out is I had, I think, 9 different loans. And I moved into my new apartment, and I think they found me, as they do. and every day I'd get home from work and there'd be just another pile of stuff from these different loan companies and names I didn't recognize. And they just stacked up on my table. And I happened to mention to a friend, I said, oh gosh, I haven't even looked at it. I have no idea what's going on there. It's so scary. And he said to me, well, why don't I come over and look at it with you? And I said, oh, that's silly. He said, no, let me look at it with you. And the next time I saw him, he said, you're in trouble. I said, why? And he said, well, you haven't asked me to come over. And I said, oh, well, actually, that night that we talked, just you inviting, offering to come over, I went home and I looked at it, and it really was okay. And so 2 things in that. I think one is this idea of like inviting somebody else in to kind of break some of the intensity, somebody to like hold our hand, in the ways that's scary. And maybe somebody that's been there before, ideally, and somebody who has a sense of the fact that usually these things maybe aren't quite as scary in reality. But also that the not knowing and the trick I was playing on myself of pretending that I wasn't thinking about it, but in reality it was kind of grinding away at me, but sort of just outside of the view. And then I knew, and so I owed a bunch of money, and that was a little bit scary. But also it wasn't as much of a mess and a nightmare as it felt. So reality, I think you're absolutely right. Even when it's really hard, even when there is bad news, it's better than the slow grinding away of constant denial.
Absolutely. We're just coming out of the holiday season. People are dealing with credit card bills they're not going to be able to slog through until the middle of spring. Some of that is generosity, but some of it was overspending. When we know that we are spending too much, why are we typically doing it? And how do we get a handle on it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, listen, as I said before, just an acknowledgement of that everybody's own experience with this is so particular. But I think there's a couple of generalities that come out in terms of your question of what's going on there, which is that I think there's an attempt at times, and I think this does come up especially around the holidays, to use spending as a kind of tool to solve an individual's emotional problems or to solve a relational problem. And so in terms of the first of those, which is certainly talked about a lot in the world, I think it's an experience, and the parallel of overeating or unhealthy eating, I think it's a good parallel that you were making earlier, which is I'm unhappy in my life in some way or another. I'm unhappy in my relationships or dealing with some disappointment or frustration in the world. And you can't open a laptop, turn on a TV, walk down the street without the world offering you a solution. There's solutions everywhere. This pair of shoes, this fancy dinner, this bottle of wine, this purse. And again, all of those things, shoes and wine and dinners, are all kind of wonderful things and things that can bring real enjoyment. But I think the tendency is that those are so easy. I pull out a piece of plastic, I hit a couple of buttons on my phone, and there it is. And in fact, I do feel better. I had this kind of fun experience of buying something. That I think experience that people are aware of, it is very, very real. And again, the particulars of what that looks like and what to do about it is ultimately, I think, one to recognize that that's happening. Oh, I'm doing this because I'm trying to solve some other problems that perhaps money and spending in this way aren't really so well suited. I sometimes say buying nice things is a fine thing to do, but it's a little bit like a great medication, but that's being used to treat the wrong illness or the wrong issue. It's not that that medication necessarily is bad. It's just not really the thing that's going to treat the issue that you're kind of pretending it's going to treat. And so the second issue that comes up, I mentioned, is kind of solving relational problems. And that's where that line that can be tricky to define between what's generosity and what's overspending, particularly like around the holidays and gift giving, is so important, is to recognize people feel guilty towards their adult child, and so they overspend on a Christmas present. Somebody perhaps is in a relationship where they've been struggling to set limits and say no because of some whatever way that they do relationships or history of that particular relationship. And so the easier thing to do that makes everybody happy, at least until you have to pay the piper and the credit card bill comes, is to say somebody's asking for money or asking for a particular gift or asking that I treat them for something, I'll just say yes. And they seem happy with me, and it temporarily solves a problem. I don't have to deal with all the stuff that's kind of complicated stuff that's bound up in saying no in our history or in my own history with setting limits. And it's what we call a bad solution. It's a reasonable enough thing to do, but perhaps not necessarily something that actually is going to address the actual issue that we're hoping or pretending that it will address.
One of the ways that you've suggested that people get a handle, particularly on impulse spending, is to have a more organized wallet. And I was thinking about this yesterday because my wallet is always a disaster, just for the record. But my way to make my wallet more organized was to get a smaller wallet with a zipper so that I could handle it. Well, I was in the grocery store yesterday with my husband. I couldn't get the zipper to unzip because there was so much crap in my wallet getting in the way of the zipper that I definitely need to fix this. But what does this work? And how do you do it?
Yeah. I mean, what really, I think the kind of psychological premise of that particular kind of hack, and hacks are great, is that when we have a disorganized relationship with something, it's easier to be in it and just say, oh, I don't even know, probably I can afford it, let me do it. And I think the default, it's always in those moments easier to say yes than to say no. It's always easier to say, sure, let's have a second bottle of wine. Sure, I'll buy the fancier version of this car that I budgeted. And I think one of the things that can contribute to that is disorganization. And I think that what we're looking at is having a sense of clarity and organizing our financial statements, organizing kind of whether we do it on paper or online, organizing that within our calendar, and your wallet is another part of that. The idea is to bring kind of a heads upness and intentionality to these kinds of decisions to hopefully slow us down. In a way, it's kind of similar to the concept of like intentional eating, self-conscious eating, which is to look and see what are the ways in which I can do this in a more clarified heads up way when there's a big pull to not stop and think and to function more from impulse.
I will be cleaning it out this afternoon, just for the record. But relationships enter the picture in a lot of different ways. We all bring our own baggage to money, our own histories to money. And when you're trying to manage yours as well as a partner's, that can get really dodgy. And the studies that scare me the most are the ones that point to the fact that the more often you disagree per week or per month, or fight per week or per month about money, the more likely you are to divorce. I mean, that's just, it's been studied, and it's one of the things that drives people apart. So how do you successfully mesh your financial style with a partner's?
Yeah. You know, money is really one of those things, like I think a handful of things in relationships where there's this idea that like we're just supposed to know what we're doing. We're just supposed to be good at it. And also I think in the experience of sort of courtship and choosing who to partner with and the early part of that process, I think it's also an area where there are a lot of assumptions around, of course we'll keep separate bank accounts, or of course we're not going to run up credit card debt. Of course we're going to buy and not rent, or of course we're not going to overspend on Christmas, whatever it is. Oh, of course we're not going to support your brother,
Right.
but it's all of this stuff that's in the, of course, category where it doesn't occur to us with this person that we're head over heels in love with and feel like we have all these things in common with and can't get over kind of all of the ways in which we're aligned, that we discover that actually there's some areas that we just happen not to have talked about where actually our values are different, or just ways of operating, or how we organize our wallets is different. And so I think one piece of that, I think, is to do what we call as therapists, make the covert overt. I think that often it can feel at that moment, I think particularly when people are on their way to getting married or newly married, I can feel a little bit like a kind of relationship nerd, which is to say, and a little bit of kind of an unromantic. But I think early on, before there are too many of those difficult money conversations, when there's the goodwill and the excitement of the relationship and perhaps things being a little bit simpler financially and otherwise, I think those are the best of times to, in a certain sense, in a certain counterintuitive sense, move towards the problem. And I think that looks like a couple of things. One is to carve out intentional space to talk about money and to take a look at where that lives, and to ask some of those questions that may seem obvious. Oh, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about that? How do you think about raising children? What are the kinds of values and ways that we want to organize money around that? The other thing I often encourage people to do before they get into some of the inevitable harder stuff that comes later is I encourage people to really, when there's what might feel like a minor problem, maybe really is a minor problem, to actually use that as an opportunity to have an even bigger conversation.
Like what?
Where there's perhaps a minor disagreement. Somebody forgets to pay a bill or spends something that was a surprise to their partner, goes to, to pick up the new car and comes back and says, oh, actually, it turns out they gave me a great deal on the nicer model. And a spouse says, wait, that doesn't seem to align with what I was thinking. And the inclination, particularly, again, relatively earlier on, might be to say, oh, no big deal. We can afford it. Not such a big thing. But perhaps not to move towards it by way of turning it into a bigger fight, but hopefully to move towards it by way of saying, I wonder if we should use this opportunity to slow down and really talk through how we want to handle this, because probably the stakes are going to get bigger as time goes on, so that you can kind of build that infrastructure of talking about money. I think one of the most important things is to really work through this thing we were talking about earlier, Jean, this tendency to avoid. And I think a lot of the trouble that couples get into is they've avoided and even maybe said to themselves like, oh, look at me, I'm being really generous. I'm not making a big deal out of that financial disagreement that emerged last week. And again, I think there's a kindness. I think certainly letting things go is an important life skill. But I think there's also some value in saying, well, gosh, maybe let's actually invite giving this some attention.
Yeah, I think that's a really good suggestion. As we wrap this up, we started this conversation by talking about how you got into financial therapy. How do we know if we need it? And if we do need it, where do we find someone to help us?
Yeah. I think it's a fantastic question. I think you need it when you've done the work to seek out good advice and good counsel from money experts, and you've found yourself kind of not able to consistently follow through with what it is they're recommending, or when a kind of anxiety around it is so strong that it's preventing you from actually being able to even seek out that kind of financial assistance and kind of make an appointment and go and get that counsel, or even think about it. I think when you recognize that there's kind of a lot bound up in this emotionally that is interfering with your ability to really make some good decisions, and obviously when you're in some trouble, the second question of how to find it, I think, is a little bit more complicated. There's this funny thing. I do think the kinds of people that tend to become psychotherapists aren't necessarily people who self-identify as being so skilled or competent with money. And so I think that the work of finding a therapist who talks very fluently about it. So I think the internet is your friend, and I think it's important to specifically look for what's somebody who's done some writing and some thinking about, or done some public conversations about money, and seems to have done some self work, as evidenced by their ability to talk fairly openly about this. Or if you don't necessarily find such a person, to call around and talk with some therapists, and kind of lead with saying, I'm recognizing that there's some emotional stuff mixed in with my financial life. Are you good at helping people with money? Is that something that you're skilled at and confident? And ask some tough questions, as you would in kind of finding somebody to provide any service for you. I encourage people. I think people often are a little bit shy about asking too much of a therapist, and maybe a little bit too forgiving earlier on. And I think it's a process that you want to get right. I think people should be picky.
Yeah, absolutely. Where can we find more about you?
Yeah. So the easiest way is at our website. I try to do an awful lot of writing, and I think it's pretty well indexed to look there specifically under the topic of money or finances, financial therapy, on my website, which is tribecatherapy.com.
Matt, thank you. This was totally great.
You're
really
welcome.
helpful.
Yeah, me as well.